Hi everyone, we are back for our third mini lecture of the female reproductive system. So let's start by looking at the different layers of the uterine wall. Alright, so the uterine wall is composed of three different layers. The outermost layer is going to be the perimetrium. Get my laser pointer ready. So the perimetrium is our outermost layer of the uterus. It is external connective tissue. Just like most of our organs, we're going to see a connective tissue layer, and then a muscular layer, and then a mucosal layer. So the perimetrium is that connective tissue. The myometrium is our muscular layer. It is going to make up a majority of the uterine wall. So when we look at the myometrium over here, we can see that it's a nice thick layer. So all of this is going to be smooth muscle. So smooth muscle that makes up most of the uterine wall is going to be the myometrium. The myometrial muscles are those that are responsible for labor contractions. When this smooth muscle contracts, it actually starts at the fundus. So contractions start at the top of the uterus and they spiral down and twist around. So they spiral and push down. And I know you can't see my hand, but if you put your hand out in front of you, like you're holding the top of somebody's head, and then you push down and twist your wrist, that's going to be what happens during the labor contraction. So they start at the top, we start contracting at the top, we're pushing down and around, sort of twisting that uterine body during a contraction. That's going to put pressure on what should be the feet of the baby, pushing down towards the cervix, right? So the feet of the baby should be up here, or actually the butt of the baby should be up here, and then the head should be resting down here. And so we put pressure on the butt and it pushes the head of that baby against the cervix to sort of open up this structure and allow them to be born. The last layer is going to be the endometrium. So the endometrium is going to be our mucosal layer. This is comprised or made up of simple columnar epithelium. You guys are going to wish I had the tablet back here. So we have columnar cells, which are tall and narrow, and it's simple, so it's just one layer. So this would be our basement membrane. So just one layer of simple columnar cells, like this, are going to make up the endometrium, as well as we have a bunch of leukocytes, glands, and macrophages that are also associated with this particular layer, or this particular structure, this particular layer of the uterine wall. So we do actually have a functional layer and a basal layer. Let me say that again. We have a functional layer and a basal layer. This can get a little bit confusing, so make sure you take careful note here. The functional layer is going to make up 2/3 of the endometrium. The basal layer is the deep third. So the functional layer is our superficial 2/3, and the basal layer is our deep 1/3. That functional layer, so the top 2/3 of the endometrium, is the structure that is lost during a menstrual period. So during a menstrual period, that functional layer actually degrades and breaks down and is lost. The basal layer is going to stay behind, so that's our deep third, going to stay behind, and it is actually going to work to regenerate that functional layer. So the functional layer is lost during a period, leaving behind the basal layer. The basal layer then goes through mitosis to make up our functional layer again. In the case of pregnancy, the endometrium is going to be where the fetus actually attaches. And I will have, when we go through the physiology of the female reproductive system, we will see actual images of those different layers of the uterine wall. So that last slide was for definition, and then we'll sort of apply those concepts and look at them a little bit more closely when we look at the physiology of the female menstrual cycle. Okay, so looking quickly at uterine blood supply, we do get quite a lot of blood flow to the uterus. That is especially important during the menstrual cycle when blood is being lost, and also during pregnancy. So during the menstrual cycle, where we're actually losing fluid and blood, we want to make sure that we can supply an adequate amount of fluid and blood back to this structure. And then during pregnancy, when we have a fetus, we need to make sure that we're bringing lots of blood in, because that's going to be the source of nutrients and oxygen and waste disposal. So lots of blood supplied to the uterus does make sense. The way that this works is we are going to start, we can actually start in the aorta, and then the aorta branches into our common iliac, and our internal iliac branches off of that. So we have this internal iliac, it's a fairly large artery still, which is going to lead to the uterine artery. So we can see we get this branch off, and then here it's going to split, and it either goes to the vaginal artery, which goes to the vaginal canal, or to the uterine artery, which is going to head towards the uterus. So we see our uterine artery heading over there. It is going to travel through some of our ligaments, and it is going to either penetrate the myometrium, or part of it is going to, remember, go and serve the ovary. So we can see we have our uterine artery, and part of it's going to go in and supply blood sort of to the outside of this ovary. The ovarian artery is going to supply blood internally, so that's one that basically runs through the medullary tissue. Okay, so let's get back to our uterine artery. The part of it that's going to serve the uterus is going to branch as it penetrates the myometrium. So we can see all these sort of fine branches coming off of this uterine artery and making their way into the muscular layer of the uterus. Once we have this branching and penetration into the myometrium, we get arcuate arteries. Arcuate arteries are going to go over top, so towards the fundus of the uterus. Think about maybe where you've heard the term arcuate arteries before and what those particular arteries look like. Right, so you should remember the term arcuate artery from when we talked about the kidneys, and we had arcuate arteries that arched over the top of those pyramids. We have a very similar shape here. This time our arcuate artery is arching over the top of the uterus. And then off of the arcuate artery, sort of all around, you can see these very small arteries. Those are called spiral arteries, and the spiral arteries are going to be the ones that penetrate through the endometrium, so penetrate through that mucosal layer of the uterus. And so these are the ones that are really going to provide the blood, those spiral arteries, to the structure during the menstrual cycle and during pregnancy. Here we are in our last stop of the internal anatomy before we switch to external anatomy of the female reproductive system. So we are now in the vaginal canal. The vaginal canal is sort of thin in terms of its overall structure and pretty stretchy. So it can go from a fairly small size to a fairly large size. That should be evident by the fact that this is how large babies can pass out of the body and into the world, right? So it's a very small structure, and then it can stretch during the birth of a baby to be quite large. In addition to birthing, it has other functions. So this is going to be where semen is going to be deposited. So initially, semen is going to be deposited, hopefully as close to the cervix as possible. That leaves it a shorter pathway to find an ovulated egg than if it is not sort of close to that cervix area. And also discharge of menstrual fluid, so anything that's coming out of the uterus needs to be able to find its way out of the body, and so the vaginal canal is sort of that connection point between internal and external. So here's a list of features. Let's sort of run through these and see what we have. So just like most other organs, we have a connective tissue, a muscular layer, and a mucosal layer, so we do see that here. I already mentioned this, but the vaginal canal is sort of tipped or pointed posteriorly, so it actually points towards the back of the body. So we have a different orientation than we see with the uterus, which points towards the front, so it points posteriorly. Unlike the cervix slightly or close above, the vaginal canal actually has no glands. So it is lubricated instead by sort of leaking of fluid through the walls, and it's also going to be lubricated by mucus coming from the cervical glands. So this is actually looking up the vaginal canal. This structure here is the cervix, so we can see that opening, which would be the opening into the uterus. You can see sort of all this milky fluid, and you can see some maybe mucus in there. That is all coming from the cervix and not coming from the walls of the vaginal canal. There are two fornices in the vaginal canal, so these are blind-ended spaces at the top of the vagina that extend just beyond the cervix, so that's sort of easier to see over here, and I actually pointed them out before without saying what they were. So here would be the posterior fornix, and this would be the anterior fornix, but the vaginal canal actually extends beyond, sort of up the side of the uterus, and so it gives the appearance that the uterus or the cervix here sort of sits down in the vaginal canal. So this is a fornix, and this is a fornix. We do have transverse ridges, so you can see them here in this actual image, so you can see these ridges along the side, and you can also see them in this cartoon image up here. Those are called vaginal rugae, and they are primarily for stimulation of both male and female during sexual intercourse. And then finally, not really shown, so I'll just sort of quickly mention this, there are mucosal folds that are called the hymen. Contrary to what is probably popular belief, the hymen does not seal off the vaginal canal, so it's not like there's a structure right here that like blocks the vaginal canal and keeps everything in and everything out, but rather it's sort of just partial folds inward, but still has a hole in it. So if there was no hole in the hymen, then a female who had an intact hymen but also had a menstrual cycle would never see that blood outside of the body. That blood would pool in the vaginal canal on top of that membrane and cause infection and other awful things. So the hymen is not a complete sheet or structure. That would be quite painful and dangerous, but rather just sort of these foldings of the mucosa that sort of get smaller and lost over age or with age. So my last note on the vaginal canal is actually looking at its epithelium, so looking at its sort of surface tissue. This tissue is really interesting and sort of unique in terms of the reproductive system, or in terms of the human body in general, because it undergoes what's called metaplasia. Metaplasia is where the type of epithelium changes over time. So in a young female, we're going to see simple cuboidal epithelium in the vaginal canal. So it's one layer and it's cuboidal. After puberty, estrogens are actually going to stimulate this tissue to change into stratified squamous. So here's stratified squamous epithelium of the vaginal canal, where we have flattened cells and we have multiple layers. The reason that we see this switch is because around the time that puberty begins is where we would expect from an evolutionary standpoint for a female to start engaging in sexual acts. And so we would like to see a more durable tissue if there's going to be penetration and friction than a less durable tissue, because this tissue would be very easily damaged, right? It's just one layer of pretty small cells, and then this is going to be many layers of much more durable cells. So at puberty, we see that switch to stratified squamous because the body is preparing for sort of that act of intercourse and reproduction. So we also see that the vaginal canal is going to have an acidic pH, and that is going to help prevent growth of pathogens in this location that is open to the external environment. All right, so that's it. We will come back for our next fourth little mini lecture looking at the external anatomy, and then we will get more into sort of the physiology of the female reproductive system, which will take up the rest of our time.